Okay, tēnā tātou katoa. Me kuaki agi roto I te krakia. E pā te matua, ko koe tēnei, ko koe te timatatanga, te mutunga ngā mea katoa. No reira, I roto I tēnei karanga, I roto I tēnei kōrero, whakawhiti kōrero, rangatira nei. Mohi anau, ko tukuna mai ki weto manaki tanga I runga I a tātou katoa. Nā te mea, ko whāri kingi ai koe, wēnei āhuatanga, I roto I a tātou. Nā e whakamuimiti ana ana ki a koe, e whakamuimiti ana, mō tō tahurika mai tau tarika wainga nui a tātou e whakawhiti kōrero. Nei inoi, I roto I te igo, te tamako tahi tō tātou ariki e hukraiti. Amen.
Amen. Kia ora, Ernest. Thank you for that. There are many things I really appreciate about Maori culture, and one of them is acknowledging leaders. And last week, we really had the privilege of hearing from some of the very distinguished leaders of Continuous Cover Forestry from overseas. I think it was a very inspiring and an excellent session. We also have leaders in New Zealand, in Aotearoa, and I think it'd be nice to acknowledge some of them too, just at the start. But we've got an excellent agenda ahead of us with some local speakers. John Dronfield, first up, Mark Bloomfield, and Radford to follow. And then we'll have questions and discussion after that. So perhaps, Mel, can we, or Isita, can we move on to the next slide? Well, we're all familiar with the guiding principles and they're on the landing page. I think we can skip this now. And I'll just briefly introduce this fifth wānanga, because in this session, we're really going to be shifting our focus onto Aotearoa, New Zealand. And I'd just like to take the time, as I've said, to actually acknowledge a few of the leaders in Continuous Cover Forestry in New Zealand. Thank you. Ian Barton is someone who really should be acknowledged in this space. He was the inaugural chair of Tāne's Tree Trust in 1999, and many of you will be familiar with his handbook on Continuous Cover Forestry in New Zealand, produced in 2008. So, Ian just needs to be acknowledged as one of the vanguards of CCF in New Zealand. The next person is on the left here, and that's John Wardle, my hero John Wardle, who with his wife Rosalie have made their property Woodside into really the go-to example of continuous forestry in New Zealand. He was the very first sustainable forest management plan approved by the government under the Part 3 of the Forests Act, and that pertains to managing the naturally regenerated black beech, but he's also a pioneer in continuous cover forestry with Pinus radiata, and Mark Bloomberg will be speaking about that shortly. So on the right is Peter Berg, who I would say he's really the impossible role model for any of us foresters in New Zealand. He's the current chair of Tāne's Tree Trust, and on his arms are really the branches that we all sit. So just like to acknowledge Peter there. But there are many other leaders in this country, and I'd also like to acknowledge all of the participants here today who, and particularly the overseas ones, because this is a kaupapa that's really going to require an awful lot of leadership and work. So now on to our speakers. First up is John Dronfield, and he's worked exclusively in the indigenous timber industry and forestry for over 25 years. So he was one of the 3 people that really started up Forever Beech. His name's inextricably associated with that brand and developing that resource. which managed 5,000 hectares of forest on the west coast of the South Island of New Zealand under multiple sustainable forest management plans. So yeah, he's really a living legend. And you know, I think we need to express how grateful we are to John for risking both his livelihood and his life to be such another example of continuous cover forestry in this country. And we can be very supportive from the comfortable positions in which we sit, and have been able to point to his efforts down there as something to aspire to. I'm sure it's been quite lonely out there at times, John. So all respect to you, and we really look forward to hearing your presentation now. Over to you, John.
Okay, my apologies. Can you hear me now? Ian,
yes.
Page, yeah,
Yep.
Great. Okay, look, thanks for those kind words. I guess there are still a few old sawmillers around on the West Coast that consider it lucky if you can count to 3 on your fingers. And that's probably all you'd need to count the active practitioners of CCF in New Zealand for the last few years. So it's a great joy, really, to see this level of interest in this method of forestry. And I really hope that, you know, in the next 20 years, we get a lot of active participation and people are able to move it forward. It's been really especially great to see international examples, which really just illustrate that we're all largely facing the same problems and the answers are out there. So while I have worked almost exclusively in Indigenous forestry, I don't want anyone today to take this as a call for more of the same. We have quite large areas of Indigenous under CCF effectively, but I see real benefits in these systems around the fringes of the exotic industry. So I'm going to talk about 3 things briefly, which come down to history, philosophy, and communication. Next slide, please. But before I start, I just want to draw your attention to some resources. On the right is a United Nations Forestry Organization study that I think was done in 2005. And the reason you should read this is so I don't have to explain the Forever Beach model or pathways to you. It's all documented in this book, which I think is online. But it tells the story when we were much younger and more enthusiastic of how we managed to bring together 18 to 20 different landowners, bring their forests under sustainable management, lodge the plans and consents, take out forestry rights over these properties, and bring together a significant resource that enabled us to get working capital to keep an industry going. So it's all in that book, so I don't need to say too much about it, except to note that I guess it was a marriage of forest owners with technical expertise from the industry of wood processing and capital, and that's where it got difficult. But I don't remember looking back all these years ever wanting to get rich off it or thinking that we'd do really well. I think Kit would agree with me, and certainly Rob Daly, who's no longer with us. When we set it up, we didn't want to exploit the forests or make money. We were really driven by making these forests productive to generate a revenue stream that could then fund what we used to term productive protection. And this model, I guess, its value is that it can be replicated, studied, modified to suit other applications in New Zealand. And the best thing about it all, looking back, is that these forests remain standing. They remain ecologically viable. They're an operating wood factory. They're intact, and mostly they're protected. And that's a huge thing people need to understand about the Forest Act amendments and the sustainability provisions. is that they are effectively a method of protection. So if someone wants to pick up a resource of continuous cover beech forestry and come and start practicing, it's all there for you today. The other book on the left, Keeping New Zealand Green, is just really, in my opinion, a great history of our forests. It was written in defence of her father, who was Pat Etrakan. And I think there was a feeling that a lot of foresters got a hard time in the conservation battles, but she wants to recognise that they did a huge amount to save our forests. And what I take out of it is that 100 years is not a long time. In 100 years, we've developed this magnificent radiata industry. I'm going to show you 40 years of it in a minute. But our forests have always faced crises, and we've always risen to the challenge. So down the bottom, it's well worth a read. Down the bottom is a little video link, and I don't know if you can click on that, but it's 2 minutes long. It's a little film I made with my son in our beech forests, and I include it purely so our foreign visitors or anyone that's interested can have a look at it. We use it as marketing, and it's a little bit cheesy, but it's got some great acting in it. And it shows really what it looks like inside our continuous cover beech forests really quite well. Next slide, please. So a short history lesson. I think it's Kit Richards gave a great overview in session 2, but living and working in these forests, I just think it's crucial to understand how we got here, to know where we're going. So excuse me for backtracking, but it'll take 3 slides. And in about 1983, if you'd driven between Christchurch and Nelson, you would have been subjected to scenes of absolute devastation. The aftermath of clear felling of beech forests. At that stage, we had a controlled economy. We had agricultural subsidies encouraging inefficiencies. And we had a wood chip export market. So there were artificialities in the economy influencing land use change. And these farmers were typically offered $10 a tonne just to clear land, and they would get subsidies to put a few sheep on it. And everything inside the red line I've scrawled on there was gone. So that's all regenerated forest that now you can see. Next slide, please. Just down the road, the New Zealand Forest Service were investigating utilisation of quite large areas of beech forest. And they put in some reasonably large coops, which were regarded as the silvicultural method of choice. They were trying to actively convert a natural forest into a plantation type forest for better wood quality. And this was beautifully sited for maximum controversy right near the main road. So these 2 events kind of kicked off the penultimate round in the conservation battles, and they ended up with the disbandment of the New Zealand Forest Service and the vast majority of our forests getting transferred to the Department of Conservation, which was established. Next slide, please. So today, if we go into these 2 stands I've just shown you, this is what we see. It was a very deliberate attempt to convert beech forest to a more manageable resource, to an even age stand, much like radiata plantation. It proved to be totally unacceptable to society. But it's important to note when you look at the stand that the silvicultural prescriptions have been neglected, so they would have come in here and thinned and pruned, and there are stands like that on the coast that are magnificent now. But nevertheless, what this is a superb example of stand regeneration. And I look back at it now and I think after 40 years perspective, you know, they didn't destroy the forest. They certainly heavily modified it, and I don't condone it, but they protected the capacity of the land to grow trees, and they got a hell of a good result from a forester's point of view. They achieved their outcomes. So if we remove the emotive fact that this is just human caused change, we're left with the forest reacting to a natural disturbance. And the message I take out of this is that the land just wants to grow trees, which is a huge plus for all of us, I guess. Next slide, please. And so, end of history lesson, we arrive in the 90s and 2000s with what I guess the industry arrived at, because all other avenues of management in silviculture were cut off. And because of the then successful helicopter logging in southwestern podocarp forests, I guess, and the availability of helicopters, we moved to a small group selection. And there was quite a lot of controversy amongst foresters over whether this was a good or bad thing in these forests. But today, our management system that has evolved is best described as near natural forest management. And in my mind, the focus is on the retention of the natural stand structure. So we're not actively trying to modify, change, or improve the structure of the forest, although I would say in these forests there is imminent possibility of doing that. We're interested in the retention of the existing species composition. So we're not high grading or favouring one species over another. We want to maintain these forests largely as they exist. Our harvest sites are mimicking naturally occurring disturbance events. Preemption of mortality is one of the key things about our system. So we're looking for occurrences of dieback and wind throw in the forest and trying to salvage trees before they succumb to mortality. The retention of habitat trees and cavity-bearing trees is a huge part of it, as you can see by that big dead spar left in the middle of a gap. There's really not a lot of space to be liberated by felling it, and there's a lot of danger involved, so we tend to leave them, and they fulfill a very important role by decaying in their own time, so it's slow nutrient release. So protection of standing dead. The retention of biomass is a pretty big thing. These natural forests have up to 30% of their volume is in rotting biomass on the ground, so we want to retain that, and it works very well with the helicopter logging because it's unmerchantable and unutilizable. We can't afford to pull that stuff out. A ground situation that would probably be pulled out and cut up for firewood. For us, it's got much more benefit in the natural forest as an elevated substrate. It rots down very quickly, and all that carbon, a lot of it will go back into the soil profile. We go to the extent of managing for soil turnover mechanisms because, you know, root plates turning over and uplifting the soil, very big part of these forests. So we can manage those effects, and we certainly record incidences of it when they occur. And at all times, I guess the mantra is to protect and liberate advanced growth. And that has ramifications for the size of the coop we're making. In the previous example of the large coop, when you start felling that many trees into an area, you destroy everything, and you're literally starting again. With this system, it's possible to find a couple of trees dying naturally in the forest, and there'll be a big surge of advanced growth, which you can then liberate by removing a few more trees. So we've possibly already got 15 or 20 years growth occurring that we can work with rather than wiping it out and starting again. And on top of all this beautiful naturalness we manage for, we've got an extraction of a regulated yield, which is set as a percentage of the annual increment. So I guess that's where we arrived at. I'm just checking my notes to see if there's anything else I have to say. I don't want to talk about logging systems, but I'll just mention, I think Mark asked me to, about the role of helicopters. We are very much tied to it because I've never seen a better way to do minimal or zero damage to a forest. We have very wet soils, and when machinery goes in here, it's a big problem. They're very much tied to the role of scale, though. We take very, very low volumes of harvest per hectare, so we need pretty big areas to work in. And they're obviously very, very high cost, so they demand a high value saw log or timber products to support the system. But the high upfront cost, I guess, is weighted against not having to build roading networks, not having in-forest tracking, which could take out 5 or 6% of your area. And then there's all the corresponding soil compaction issues in our soils and root damage to surrounding trees. So we made a decision early, and it's been hard work, but it's I haven't seen a better way to extract timber from a forest, to be honest. Okay, next slide, please. I think this is where the philosophy comes in, and I just want to have a little intermission here. I read a while ago in an article that if you refined the environmental movement and their beliefs and philosophies and everything that they believed into one word, that word would be enough. And I thought that when I read that, I thought that's really pretty cool. Or how would I refine what I believe in our philosophies? So while I've got a lot of like minds, I guess here I'll put a challenge to you. I thought, how do I refine everything about our forestry, our philosophy of wise use, I guess, that encompasses taking responsibility for production within the natural world and giving an equal weighting to non-timber values and timber production. And I came up with the word balance. Okay, so if anyone has any brilliant ideas to beat that, put them up on the screen, please. But my notes around philosophy are that we have a lot of competing ideologies around forest use, and I just felt after 20 years of battling it, I need to talk about it. And that comes down to relationships with ENGOs. I came into this after the clear felling days. I saw clear felling in Southland, and I thought, that's not for me, there's got to be a better way. So I came in and worked only in this type of forestry, but I saw continuous cover forestry and near natural forest management as a bridge, I guess, between production forestry and environmentalism. And I'd say that our goals and objectives are largely the same. We're swimming down the same river, but we really do disagree on it. By the early 2000s, we had the total victory of preservation of forest resources on Crown lands. So we were left with private land only. And even today, sustainable forest management, as enshrined in the Forest Act, is not accepted by ENGOs in old growth forest. And when I say old growth, I mean read natural. They'll begrudgingly accept it on private land. I think about the opposition to the cyclone ether legislation a few years ago, when we were able to recover some wind-thrown trees off about 40,000 hectares of storm damage. And Russell Norman at the time, and he won't mind me using his name because he loves publicity, but Russell told me that he was a professional policy advisor, and in his opinion, the only way to protect land was to draw bright lines around it and preclude human use of anything within those boundaries. So that's a remarkably different strategy from me. I think that's a valid strategy on a huge amount of our country, but there must be marginal forest around the edge where we can have a compromise. And, you know, across our country, we have these segregated, intensified land uses. We're very much into conservation on this land type, production on this land type, and never shall the twain meet. It's only when the boundaries are really getting pushed that, you know, some of the issues with intensification are coming to the fore, and I guess that's what's throwing up interest in systems like this. I want to also talk about a experience I had, some of you will be familiar with, when I dared to suggest that the Grey District Council, who owned an 800 hectare block of land owned by their ratepayers, could put a sustainable management plan on it and get some revenue to help their ratepayers. I got 14,000 forest and bird submissions against it. So I had the soon-to-be Minister of Conservation, Eugenie Sage, putting articles in the paper with pictures of clear felling. And it's an odd feeling. I know that Kit will know what I'm talking about, but it's not many people experience that level of public hatred, I guess. It's quite odd. But anyway, you know, the annoying thing about it is that we've had the Forest Amendments Act for 25 years at this stage, and you've got an incoming Minister of Conservation blatantly ignoring it and claiming that we're going to clear fell the forest and end the world. So we haven't had an easy run with sustainable management. In fact, it's bizarre that that level of misunderstanding or deliberate misunderstanding is even allowed. But no one from the government stood up to help. No one from the agencies responsible for promoting sustainable management are going to put their hands up. So I just wanted to bring that to your attention. And next slide, please. And competing ideologies go on, I guess. I was recently skiing, I think 2 weeks ago in Tekapo, which is now a 12 months of the year recreational town, summer and winter. And for our foreign guests, I guess I've seen this country before in the Tibetan Plateau and in Montana. It's wide open, big sky country. And trees, I think in this landscape, I'd be safe to say, occupy less than 5% of the landscape. But 95% of those trees will be exotic, introduced trees. And at the moment, there's an orthodoxy that around the Queenstown, Tekapo areas that want the removal of every exotic tree in the landscape. And this forest in the foreground is a recreational forest full of mountain bike tracks. It's actually a mixed species forest. At the moment, it's being clear felled and mulched, so it's going. And the orthodoxy, I guess, covers the lupins at the lake edge. They're being sprayed out, despite being the mainstay of a multi-million-dollar tourist industry. So I get that they're wilding pines, and everything you need to know is in the text, I guess. They're listed as pests, and they're prone to producing conifers, and they cost the taxpayer millions of dollars a year to remove. But I contend probably that, you know, when these trees were planted many, many years ago, they were regarded as the right tree in the right place. And somewhere along the line, we've just neglected an appropriate management strategy to control them. So for me, this is kind of the type of forest we could be interested in. I think there's a planting plan to replace these forests with 40 different indigenous species. But the orthodoxy has won in this case. I also think that an alternative reality could have been a management plan under CCF forestry that, you know, really supported the recreational uses and generated some revenue, which could then be used to be bonded to control wilding spread in the area. But not to be in this case. Next slide, please. I also just put this in case anyone's got up at 1 in the morning to watch. But once again, forget the mountain. The foreground shot shows larch, Douglas fir, probably a couple of types of pine, all regarded as pests, all regarded as invasive. And I think a lot of the stand has been chewed up as well now. But okay, so slide 10, please. Next slide. So just to finish on that segment, despite Russell Norman's best intention, I wasn't able to plant trees 100 years ago to utilise today. So my focus is I see opportunities in some of these regenerating stands, despite them being on DOC land. Planting forests for timber production, very difficult economics, unless, of course, it's a state-funded write-off like the 1920s and the establishment of the Forest Service. Or we can tie other revenue streams like carbon sequestration and biodiversity credits to it. But here we have 40 years of hard work done for us at no cost. So for me, it makes sense to get into these and those exotic forests. This is the low-hanging sunk cost stuff we need to be into. I just want to talk very briefly about stand development because it kind of backs up a possible use of silviculture. But these forests are typically in the stem exclusion stage at the moment. There's a lot of mortality going on, largely thinning themselves from below, but they're very, very wind infirm because the roots basically mimic the crown size, so they have very poor rooting. And typically these stands will blow over. A big wind gust will come through and smash them out. A few survivors around the edge will quickly gain some crown and corresponding root growth and stabilise, and the stand will reinitiate, and you'll get cohorts within the forest, but it takes a long, long time, and it could go through the cycle 2 or 3 times before moving through into a more stable phase. So silvicultural intervention here can be very, very beneficial. We could get a much more diverse forest. We can get a much stronger forest. We can build in a lot of naturalness to it. We'll get a understory reinitiation coming back. And we could arguably generate some income. Okay, I'll move on to the next slide. So I guess just talking about retaining knowledge, just a few comments on that. Aotearoa rākau has become very much in recent years just a regulatory enforcer. They're not, historically, they've been extremely supportive of our industry. We've had lots and lots of interest from them, lots and lots of ways to try and push us and develop it. In the last 6 or 7 years, we don't see much except just checking on what we're doing and making sure we're doing it legally. There's been a huge loss of institutional knowledge from these departments too. We've had the last of the Forest Service cadre retire recently. In the last few years, they've had decades of work experience in these forests. So we get a churn of people on short rotation secondments, I guess, coming through middle management and people on the ground. They don't stay long, and they don't necessarily have forestry backgrounds. But I'm very, very supportive of the model forest concept, or the exemplary forestry network. We've taken hundreds of visitors through our forests and our demonstration stands, from Crown ministers and government officials to international field trips and classes of school kids. We used to have a strong relationship with the School of Forestry, and we established a couple of quite good-sized trials with them, which we haven't been back to visit for many years. But the geography is difficult for us. We're 3 hours from the major cities, so getting Crown ministers into our forests is a big mission. So I suggest you can do a lot of this work with short videos like the one you can watch later. You can impart a lot of information and the visuals very, very effectively. I guess I question, just to throw out some broader based questions, what's the role of the state in all of this going forward? We have a New Zealand Forest Service and lots of downgraded second growth stands. Are they just going to be a regulator, or are they going to be involved on the ground? We have to remember the role of the state in jump-starting the exotic plantation and consider whether that investment is paid off. Okay, next slide. I'm not sure where the time's at, Paul. I've only got 2 to go. So I guess communication. I'm not going to admit a fetish, but I've got a deep love of these forestry silvicultural schematics. I think as a way to impart information, they're up there with the periodic table and the London Underground map. And I know you're all sitting there desperately trying to read all this information and take it in and figure out what I'm talking about. But that's not why this is here. This is here to show that this is a really information-dense space, and forestry is an extremely jargon-rich environment. And we've had many, many terminologies over the last few weeks to describe effectively the same thing. So as well as being sawmillers and foresters and marketers, I guess in our jobs, we've had to be communicators probably more than anything. And we've had a pretty unsellable message to sell a lot of the time. So as well as everything else, we've been in a battle for hearts and minds. And I think we will face a lot of that. We will face possibly a lot of pushback from the status quo in the existing industry. And we have to be able to justify ourselves and have very, very clear arguments. Because as cynical and terrible as it sounds, I've really learned that you can't argue against emotion with facts and evidence. So messages need to be really simple for public consumption. I've learned that the average reading ability is equivalent to 12 years old. So I guess my main question for us all is, what is our message? And it has to really hit you in the heart and be good and strong, and then you can't lose. But on a positive note, we have a fantastic story to tell. And just the last slide, please. I'd cut this one out because I had so much personal cringe about it, but talking to Ramona the other day, she had so many points that just mimicked what I think. So I've put it into link with her presentation at the end here. So we have all this siloed thinking in our society and our land use agencies. Everyone's trying to achieve their little goals, often at the detriment of someone else. I think we just need to blow up the silos, and we need to become like strands in a braided river, all moving the same direction, all interconnected. And that's all I've got to say to you people today. So thank you.
Well, thank you, John. That was great. That always rely on you to have not just the pragmatism of a practitioner and some challenging thoughts and some excellent quotes it's just terrific. And it leads on very nicely to our next speaker, who, while I agree with the need for capturing the heart, I also think the need to capture the mind and the nuts and bolts is also so important. And Mark Bloomberg, seen here in the middle, is an academic, outstanding in the field. And in this case, the field is at Woodside. John Wardle to his right. And I think Richard to his left. I'd like to acknowledge Mark's excellent research work on the topic, and also just the value and the role of science, robust science generally. So Mark's a senior adjunct fellow at the Tukura, the School of Forestry of Canterbury University, and also a researcher and lecturer at Lincoln University. And I think, it's just so important that we also have researchers and research institutes as an essential part of this community that is required to inform our developing ideas on continuous cover forestry options and practice. It will certainly be a braided river, as John suggests, and not everyone needs to wield a chainsaw to be a champion of it. So I'd like to invite Mark now to give a presentation. So is Mark ready for that?
Yeah. Can you hear me okay, Paul?
Yes.
Brilliant. Well, thank you for the introduction, and thank you to Tane's Tree Trust for the opportunity to speak. So I'll begin. I want to talk about alternatives to clear felling harvests for New Zealand's exotic pine plantations. Next slide, please. And I think it's good to talk context. Why should we even be concerned with alternatives to clear felling in our radiata pine? We're harvesting every year now over 30 million cubic metre. Last I looked, about 93% of this volume comes from clear felling radiata pines, grown on a 30-year rotation. Also useful to say, well, what do we mean by clear felling? The definition in Ian Barton's book, I think based on work in the UK, is cutting and extracting all trees on an area more than 0.25 of a hectare. So you can have very small clear fells, but of course in New Zealand, in our plantations, these can extend over hundreds and hundreds of hectares of contiguous harvested area, as shown by the classic aerial photos by John Johns. Now, why do we do it? Well, it's been extremely successful. The New Zealand exotic forest industry over a little more than 100 years has been a fantastic success story in terms of being able to grow a sustainable wood resource. Clear felling, as we know, it's cheaper, and for the forester, it's easier to manage than any other system. Next slide. Another bit of context, though, is to stand back and say, well, where does clear felling stand in the range of possibilities? Now, it's a complicated subject. Foresters start talking about seed trees, shelter woods, darwood, darvolt, and so on. Let's just look at a continuum of tree removal, and the clear cut comes in there where virtually every tree is removed. We can use systems which leave some trees behind, like seed trees or shelterwood, which are there typically to encourage further regeneration. If we leave 70% of the crop or more, we're into selection, continuous cover forestry, traditional uneven age management. Let's just put up the proposal that if we're going to look at alternatives to clear felling and radiata, let's not just be over on the right-hand side of that diagram. Let's look at a range of alternatives that may be able to better achieve our objectives. Okay, next slide. Now, why should we particularly want to do it? Well, I think there's a lot of drivers, actually, but the two big ones in New Zealand, for my opinion, about 25% of our plantation forests are on erosion-susceptible land, and we are discovering that if we clear fell that land and there is a high-intensity rainfall, bad things happen in terms of sediment and logging slash. And so that really calls into question the viability of large clear felling areas. Another driver that's come to the fore, we've seen large areas planted for permanent forests for carbon sequestration, which achieves the objectives in the medium term. But radiata pine is a tree of about 90 to 150 years maximum lifespan. Later on down the track, if we leave those forests as is, what happens? Do they degenerate? Do they collapse? Is there an opportunity to transform to some kind of mixed age or mixed species forest? And what we've got to say is, given these two reasons to scrutinize large-scale clear felling, we may have to have some kind of variable retention clear felling as part of our forestry mix. Next slide. Just wanted to chuck this in. New Zealand foresters see radiata pine as a pioneer species. In other words, a species that's the first colonizer after a big disturbance, like clear felling. It's seen as light demanding. It needs to be in the open, and with all that light, it will grow rapidly. You know, it sounds like a weed, and that's what some people call radiata. Interestingly, the US foresters don't even call it radiata, of course, they call it Monterey pine. They classify it as an intermediate species. It is more shade tolerant than any other pine species in Western North America, ponderosa and so on, contorta, more shade tolerant. There's plenty of literature describing natural stands in Monterey and around the Monterey Peninsula that are mixed age with regeneration and gaps created by disease, tree fall, low intensity fires. It doesn't have to be grown as a pioneer species in rapid growing even age plantations. It's capable of growing in a more mixed age structure. Next slide. So that's a bit of context. Now I want to talk about how some of these ideas might play out in Woodside Forest, which is a small scale forest 56 kilometres to the northwest of Christchurch, owned and managed by John and Rosalie Wardle. Now, when the Wardles came to the property in the early 70s, there was regenerating black beech, which is another story. I won't talk about that, but there was almost 30 hectares of dense gorse, and they didn't bother to regenerate beech. They planted it in pine, and they kept planting for just over 10 years. Now, in subsequent slides, I've broken this small area down into 5 strata, from the very oldest to the very youngest stands. All stands were pruned and thinned. Now, the Wardles had the opportunity to clear fell 30 years after they had begun planting and decided not to. Instead, they opted for another harvesting strategy called target diameter harvesting. And of course, being the oldest stand, they began at stratum 1. Next slide, please. Now, TDH, that's what I'm going to call it, is just harvesting of individual crop trees in your stand once they reach a desired diameter. Actually, ironically, it's the economically optimum time to harvest a tree, not least because the log value in terms of what we call a price size gradient, which is a fancy way of saying that big logs are worth more, that's best achieved by picking out your biggest tree and harvesting that and letting the smaller trees grow a bit bigger before you harvest them. In fact, if you look at that stand in the diagram, if you clear fell that, you're actually harvesting the smaller trees probably too early, maybe some of the bigger trees a bit too late. Clear felling is always a compromise in terms of getting the best value. It might be a good value for the stand, but some trees are being sacrificed too early, some are being harvested too late. So TDH does have economic aspects to it as well as others. Okay, next slide, please. Now, I wanted to play a short 8-minute video that we made in collaboration with the Farm Forestry Association about, 5 years ago. No time. So there's the link, and it's accessible and it's available on YouTube as well and through the Farm Forestry website. Just wanted to say that the target diameter that was chosen for the radiata pine was pretty big, 60 centimetres. The other thing about Woodside is the topography allowed ground-based harvesting, which made a much easier job. Sure, there was some steep slopes, but they were short. Manual tree felling and skidder extraction were possible with logs marketed by a local consultant. And if you want to see how it looks in practice, the video will cover that ground. Next slide, please. Yeah, I'm supposed to be a researcher, so there's going to be tables and graphs. Sorry, guys. These 5 strata, we measured them 2 years ago. And what I want to emphasize is you'll see that in the oldest stratum, stratum 1, by now there's only about 70 odd trees that haven't been harvested from the original crop. The rest is all regeneration, starting from we measured from about 5 centimetres DBH up. So it makes sense that the actual volume at this time is quite low. If you went down to stratum 5, which has scarcely been touched, and stratum 4 for that matter, you can see much higher volumes. Now, there's a lot of talk about whether some kind of continuous cover can help to maintain high standing volumes, but our problem that we've got with radiata pine, as we'll see, is we do need to open the stand up, maybe get down to about remove up to half the crop trees before we really get enough light into the forest to start to see regeneration. So it's likely that in doing some kind of continuous cover forestry with radiata pine, we are going to see a dip in standing biomass before we get the regenerated crop coming through. Next slide, please. So that's, and it's just surprising what sort of delay there was. Chris Perry was an honours student at the school who did a very good dissertation on Woodside 10 years ago now. You can see there's Chris, and you can just see the regeneration starting to come through. Came back with the Farm Forestry Association. I think Eric must have taken the picture because he's not in it. I think he was there. And pretty much the same location. You can see that the regeneration has really taken off. And that took place within about 5 or 6 years. Other point about regen, people like Ian Page showed that regen was pretty patchy in places like Aotearoa back in the 1960s. And that's true. You won't get uniform regen of radiata pine. And wetter or shadier sites, John has had to supplementary plant. He's chosen to go with moisture demanding, shade more shade tolerant species such as redwoods and cypresses, and they're doing fine. John and Rosalie feel they've got 80 hectares of black beech. Although there is prolific indigenous regeneration in some places, they've chosen to remove that and focus on creating a mixed exotic resource. But the option is there if you wanted it. Next slide, please. More graphs, but not too many more. Look, the diameter distribution is the go-to tool for the forester who would manage a mixed age or mixed structure forest. I won't speak too much about it, just to point that in stratum 1, the oldest one, you can see in the top left corner a small residue of larger trees, and then you can see the young crop coming through. In stratum 2, the next crop, you can just see the beginnings of a regeneration crop, not appearing yet in the other 3 strata that they're coming. The other point that is that you'll notice there's no trees bigger than 67.5 centimetres. That's because once they've reached 60 centimetres, they're likely to be harvested within a year or 2. So potentially, some of these older stands are over, 50 years old now. There could be potential for much larger trees, except they were all removed as part of the target diameter harvest. Next slide. What does that mean? 2 things, really. There's been a steady increase in production. Now, the orange bars, being Canterbury, we get wind throw, and this would happen in whether we were thinning the stands out or not. But the thing about target diameter harvesting is that you do have to go to the expense of roading your forest in advance, and that is expensive. But it does mean any time wood goes down, you don't have to muck around getting a road in place. And because your loggers are there every year, they just go around the forest and pick up most of the windthrow as a salvage operation, and that just gets added to the overall volume of production. So one advantage with this style of management, provided the windthrow is not absolutely catastrophic, which it hasn't been, windthrow can be just seen as part of the harvesting program of the forest. Next slide. Last graph, I promise. Now, if you're having trouble reading that graph, you focus on the blue line, which is the pruned logs. We're getting 30 to 40% of the volume as high quality pruned logs year on year. Somewhere between 40 to sometimes up to 60 or 70% of the outturn can be high value domestic S-grade structural logs. Export comes and goes, as export does, but it's not a critical part of the production. And the only thing to notice with the windthrow, which is denoted by the bars rather than the lines, is that the blue bars are the pruned, and you'll notice that there's always less pruned percentage in the windthrow. That's just because the windthrow tends to be smaller trees. It's the 60 centimetre diameter of the target diameter trees that really allows you to maximize the production of those big butt logs and get the prune volume up. Next slide. It's difficult to analyze this system because it's a small family farm. It's not your classic greenfields forest investment. But my colleague David Everson's working on that at the moment. He says that from his point of view, if the Wardles had decided to clear fell their forests as opposed to what they did, their returns would not economically have been that much different. So it's been an economically neutral decision. Just note there's no carbon revenue in this forest, it's pre-Kyoto. And the other thing is that the levels of returns are on an annual farming, or on an annual basis, equivalent, say, to a family-owned pastoral farm, noting that this piece of land, it's in forest because it could not succeed as farm. It was far too infertile and difficult. So from a piece of very poor land, you've now got a family with a livelihood of 120 hectares that would have been equivalent to some sort of decent sheep farm. Okay, next slide. Okay, I've got a few conclusions after 20 years of and it's been a privilege to work with John and Rosalie over that 20 years working in Woodside. TDH is silviculturally feasible in radiata pine. It can work. And where you don't get the regen, well, then you just have to look at more active management. Harvesting is feasible on ground-based terrain. On steep lands, well, you know, why shouldn't we look at it at least before saying it's not possible? Economically, it's not the big loss. Sure, the partial harvesting is expensive, but the value of the outputs year on year in terms of logs are higher than if you just clear felled the whole stand. Environmentally, host of benefits. Notice the lack of large skids. When you're only pulling, you know, 30 or 40 cubic meters per hectare to the road, you don't need a skid to stack and store it. And what sort of new crop can we expect? Well, in places we can regenerate a mixed age radiata pine forest. We could look at actively planting other slower exotic species that have longer rotations, such as redwoods, or we could look at assisted regeneration of indigenous species. We had that opportunity to create a mixed age or mixed species forest from a single age, single species plantation. Yep, that's about it. I think next slide. So there's Richard Pearson, who was at the time we did this study, was the bushman doing the directional felling, and he's got a big smile on his face. I think he enjoyed himself. Happy to discuss. Thank you.
Excellent. Thank you, Mark. That was superb. And I certainly encourage everyone to look up that video. And it's great to have the academic and robust research basis that underpins that comparison and shows that continuous cover forestry, certainly on some sites, is a realistic and viable option. And some of those potential management options for different species as well, different objectives, was quite exciting too. The next speaker is Ramona Radford, who is the project lead for Ngā Pauatane, the Māori Forest Owners Association. I've had the pleasure of working with Ramona on the Tōtara Industry Pilot Project. I'm not exactly sure what she plans to deliver today, but I'd like to just take the opportunity to point out that she's largely been responsible for the fullness of this Wānanga series, that she was involved with the planning and has certainly influenced the shape this is taking. So I'll now hand over to Ramona and look forward to hearing what she has to say.
Thank you, Paul. And thank you, Mark and John, for really compelling, powerful messages in your deliveries there. I'm going to try and keep my time to 10 minutes. So by way of introduction, ko kapuarangi maunga, te waitapu o te wainui, tainui waka, ngai tai iwi tōrere nui arua te marae, ko Ramona Radford aho. Tēnā rā koe e te reo karakia o tēnei ahi, e ngā mana, ngā rangatira mā, ngā hauewha e te kaimahi kaupapa nei. So good afternoon, everyone. I've just introduced my mountain, my river, and my ancestral home. I've acknowledged whoever it was that gave our opening karakia today. Also the mana of the landowners beneath the long white cloud that we're also familiar with. Also those here from the four winds of the earth, our friends from other nations, and the holders of knowledge, our collaborative coalition on the matter of close to nature continuous cover forestry for Aotearoa. Can you see what's on the screen?
Need to put it on presentation, Ramona.
Okay.
Kia ora. Perfect. But you've muted yourself, Ramona. Too many.
Technical difficulties. You would have been watching my script as I was saying it. Apologies, everyone. Okay, so I'm just going to move my screen because it's on the wrong place on my computer here. Sorry, everyone. Okay.
Yeah, you know, you need to switch back to the full screen.
Full screen.
Yeah.
All right. There we go.
Perfect.
Better?
Perfect.
Right. Sorry, everyone. Okay. Okay, the subject of today's session is enabling continuous cover forestry, innovation and practice excellence in Aotearoa. So you've heard from two leaders, pioneers in the subject of continuous cover forestry in New Zealand. And my presentation today centres on what we as a organising committee imagined from the outset of this project, which is that the third generation of cultivated forests in Aotearoa would be grounded in the Māori worldview. So what do we mean by that? And in essence, what that is the view that Papa Tuanuku is our Earth Mother. And also, in conjunction with that, the idea that the pivotal role of the Māori forestry paradigm has towards enabling close to nature continuous cover forestry. The Māori worldview, and I know that there are many across the continuum of Māori worldviews. But in general, ours would be an ecosystems first view or a nature positive paradigm. But we're also realists where that's concerned. So the series attempted to start by drawing a ring around the current position of forests in Aotearoa, by examining the forces for change that weigh upon us and upon the decisions of today, addressing the long neglected rights and interests of Māori with forest land and cultural responsibility to future generations, to further and preserve the work of Te Taiao, or in other words, the environment. The second point was that we talked about climate change and New Zealand's international commitments to reducing global emissions, and that includes greenhouse gas capture and the return of the planet into balance. Ultimately, that's a big goal. And then we talked about the challenges that are faced by continuous cover forestry pioneers like John, Kit Richards, who spoke to us in the second session, and Mark here today, Tane's Tree Trust and others. And the practitioners and the advocates across a period of 5+ decades. We then moved to hearing and interrogating, where it was necessary, the models and exemplars of close to nature continuous cover forestry operating with what we might consider to be better success than Aotearoa across the globe. So we heard from Central Europe, from Slovenia, Ireland, and the eastern part of the US. And they all said and disclaimed, they were all very careful to say or leave the disclaimer that their models are also not perfect and that they have plans to do much more and to keep improving. The state of Ireland, when they began their journey, in many ways is similar to the position of Māori land. a state where, although we are landowners, constitutional decisions were made for us about our land, and we find ourselves at a point where we no longer have the indigenous forests that once existed, and where our lands have been modified, and where we are now in 2023 wanting to change that. So in essence, my message today is what got us here is not what's going to get us to that end goal, that goal of the perfect forest, the perfect national forest estate that we're all trying to get to. In respect to that, the current state of Māori forestry also moves across scales. So when Mark is talking about the Warrels property, that would be considered a small scale forest in comparison to the forests that sit on a wide range of Māori forested land. So our economic contributions, Māori economic contributions, should be the ultimate indicator of the rising economic tide of this nation's forests, one would think. And as we move towards our goal of, the Māori goal of mana motuhake, or mana through self-determining means, to re-indigenize the landscape of what we think is a colonized landscape. So the Māori forestry paradigm, what is this? So we all like to think that this might be the picture that we're all trying to get to. This might be the end state of all the decisions that are made, that we want to make in 2023. But this was the starting place for Māori pre-1800s. So we have a living memory of this state and this type of forest life. Our language, our knowledge systems, our practices are all tied to this original state of forestry. But we all know the history of what occurred when the English came to this land and the land was cleared of its native cover, its natural forestry cover, and it back in those days, we didn't really, our ancestors, both Māori and Pākehā ancestors, did not really understand what might come down the track because of the decisions that were made back then. But here we are in 2023, and Māori land sits in two dichotomies. One, the plantation forestry estate, and two, the national conservation estate. I don't know, bar the Crown, that any other group can claim to understand what that means for us, or how we might, or the position that puts us in, and how we might have to make different decisions going forward. Our history with the current state of forestry on Māori land begins actually with confiscation and alienation from our lands. And until the 1990s, when our land was thrust into, and might I say without our say-so, into the dichotomy of conservation and commercial forestry. And this was the same point at which treaty transfers has started to take place. So this forest accord was signed in the 90s, 1990, and since then, we could say that Māori have begun our journey as Māori forestry owners. So we have only been working as Māori forestry landowners since the 1990s. So what does that mean for us? So Māori forestry landowners in this dichotomy, I mean, what does this mean for us? This is what it means for us. And this is something to bear in mind when you are making decisions for policy and decisions for investment, decisions for what happens around forestry from this point forward. This is the current Māori forestry paradigm, where we have been colonised, and with us, so have our lands. And we've been forced to decouple from the Indigenous worldview of our land as our mother, ko au te whenua, ko te whenua ko au, into units of production with primarily profit first imperatives. And this has had a devastating effect on our landscapes as well as on our communities. This current state doesn't sit well with Ngā Pauatane. And so now we are working to turn around what we consider to be the status quo and to move the destiny of our lands and our people to one of mana motuhake. Mana motuhake meaning the mana to determine for ourselves where we might go from here. And this will help our people to recloak our whenua with the forests that will help us to re-indigenize our landscapes. As I said before, we are realists, and we don't believe that the answer is to just recloak everything in native, because we understand as foresters that there are challenges and barriers to doing that. It is our position that the re-establishment of native forests must stand on its own merits, environmentally, economically, culturally, and socially. And we have a responsibility to show this with good modelling and evidence, not by throwing away radiata pine on our land, but by working with radiata pine to transition our lands to a future state that we desire. And so we are supporting ways to transition our lands to work from where we are today to where we want to be tomorrow. And if we can do this, then we will assume that anyone can. And this might be what the Māori forestry paradigm in 21-23 might look like. Might be a mix of land uses that is getting somewhere close to what Māori landowners in general want, in which but how do we get there? How do we ensure that our lands remain economically viable and that our communities remain connected through whakapapa and also through mahi or work or livelihood to the whenua. And if this might be the Māori forestry paradigm of the future, we might guess that this might be in 200 or 300 years from now. So, how do we move from here? This is where we are today, so how do we move from here? We think it's by championing new forestry management methods, new forestry management tools, and supporting the development of new incentives and policy. One of those practices is continuous cover forestry. But it's not all that we need to have in our kete, because as you saw, our lands are quite different from most. We need to have multiple purposes for the scale of land that we own. One way that we've determined that we will do this is through multiple use forestry and multiple use land management. Many types of forest, many purposes with multiple kaupapa. We also need new tools to break down the silos that John so eloquently spoke about. So when we think about those silos of information, this is in essence what we're talking about. Every piece of data that is produced on our land is going into silos. Some of those silos we own, some of those silos the government owns, some of the silos private forestry companies own. But what would it look like if we created a seamless integration of forestry decisions, forestry management, forestry data, to help us get to where we want to go to faster and under a more collaborative approach? When I talked about the dichotomies of conservation and plantation forestry, as we've found out through our investigation, our global investigation, this dichotomy is actually quite specific to New Zealand. It doesn't really exist anywhere else. And I think, and Aotearoa thinks, that this is one of those things we need to smash. We need to remove that dichotomy, and we need to bring together the two ends of forest, so conservation and commercial forestry, and try and develop that place in the middle to broaden out the wide range of values, the wide range of benefits that forests and other lands are able to obtain. For this reason, we think there is enormous room for us as a nation to improve. And the Continuous Cover Forestry project, which you've all been a part of, one thing you might not know is that it's been umbrellaed by the Ngā Pauatane multi-use ngahere proof of concept, which is an exploration into how we as a nation can infuse tikanga-informed methods into forestry management that is carried out on Māori land. It is also developing an integrated forestry data management system to break down the silos of information and help us to make our decisions for the forests that we establish upon our mother, Papatuanuku, to create, instead of two dichotomies and many ideologies, a seamless national forestry estate that is carrying out multiple functions and driving wider imperatives in a stable and predictable framework. There is an opportunity for the Close to Nature Continuous Cover Forestry Coalition that we are creating here to use the multiple use Ngāhere project as the container for the development of diversified forests, diversified landscapes, diversified sectors, and diversified views and perspectives to deliver greater benefit across a wider range of values for New Zealanders and for once for Ngai Māori. Nō reira, tēnā koutou, tēnā koutou, tēnā koutou katoa. Thank you.
Thank you, Ramona. That was a pretty dense 10 minutes. There's a lot in there, so we'll need to think about all of that. I take that that's a perspective, probably a bit of a combination of personal perspective and from Ngā Pauatane. I'd like to just say certainly the multi-use Ngāhere is a pretty common theme that's been going through here, but I'd just like to make it clear to everyone and all the participants that there is no orchestrated sort of plan here to really massage things to a certain point, as far as this is a discussion about exploring continuous cover forestry and the options and possibilities for New Zealand, and that you are all participants in this, and I just don't want to have it misunderstood that this is got a plan or agenda behind it any more than developing options and models for the future. So we're very short on time. I think there's a few questions in the box there. I've got about 3 minutes time. I think it might be best just to ask Ernest if he would wrap up with a closing karakia, and we'll perhaps try and follow up the questions individually later, and look forward to you joining on the next session, which is on a Friday, and I think it's at 11 o'clock, but you'll all be sent emails for that. Anyway, Ernest, if you're still available to close off, that would be much appreciated.
Yep, you got it. Can you hear me all right?
Yep.
Okay. O tēnā koe, Ramona, mo te whakatū tātou I te tangata whenua runga I tēnei āhuatanga, nō reira tēnā koe. Very good. I enjoyed all the speakers, and so we'll close off with a karakia. E pā te matua. E hari ana te ngākau, ko wainga nui a koe I roto I o tātou kōrero, ko rongo koe te tangi o te ngākau, I roto I tēnei mea, ko tātou katoa hihena ki te mahi tēnei mahi kia tika. Nano reira, tukuna mai tō mana ki tanga, kia pai hoki te haere, kia tatu, kia waiho hei taonga. He taonga mo tō tātou whakatumuraka ko te haere mai. Nano reira, tukuna mai tō mana ki tanga kuru tui ki runga I a tātou katoa, I roto I te ingoa hiukraiti tō tātou ariki. Āmene.
Kia ora.
Kia ora.
You're welcome.